Okay, and just so you guys know, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll talk about them at the end of the presentation. And as we go along, if you think of things, definitely go ahead and put them in there. And I do have some resources for you all at the end of the presentation. I know that sometimes with rain gardens, there is a bit of technical information, especially with calculating the size and understanding the drainage area for your rain garden. So I do have some resources for you at the end that you guys can take and look at those. Just to have more of a reference if you decide you want to put one in your home garden. And you can also as well, feel free to email me and get the list of plants that's in this PowerPoint. The recommended plants includes trees, shrubs, and perennials that all do well in rain gardens. So I'm happy to share that list of plants with you. So feel free to ask if you're interested. All right, so to get started this morning, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Carol Stringer. I am the Fulton County Agriculture Agent. I'm located in the North office, that's in Sandy Springs. And if you're familiar with Melissa, she is our South Agriculture Agent located in East Point. So today's presentation is, like I've mentioned, it's on rain gardens and the home landscape. And this is not just a full disclosure, I didn't originally create this PowerPoint, but you'll see that a lot of the information is still really good, and I think that you guys are going to enjoy it today. Okay, so why do we want to have rain gardens in our landscapes? So the big reason that we have here is, well, actually, this is just an outline of what we're going to cover here. So we have stormwater, how it contributes to pollution, solutions to our stormwater issues. And then I'm going to talk about how we're going to build our own rain garden for our home. So the big reason that we have issues with stormwater in our urban areas is impervious surfaces. So in a natural environment, when you have a rainstorm, about 50% of the rainwater from that event is going to be absorbed and percolated back into the soil. And about 10% of it will run off, depending on how much rainfall happens. But in a urban environment, the ratio is reversed, right? So 55% of that is going to run off, or it's going to kind of be collected, and it's going to go into storm drains. It's going to go into gutters and create lots of pools and puddling. And only about 15% of that water in an urban environment is absorbed. So as you can see, this is a big disruption from the natural water cycle. It creates a lot of problems. It can lead to flooding downstream. It can cause a lot of issues with buildings, foundations, things like that nature. And just as well, it also creates an issue where it's all of those pollutants that we have in our urban environments on the streets and especially at parking lots, those are going to be washed into our waterways, which is something that we don't want. So impervious surfaces, just to go over it, that's going to be things like blacktop, concrete, our roads, our buildings, our pavement, any of that is quote unquote impervious. It does not allow for water to go through it and enter the soil. So it impedes or prevents infiltration of the water, prevents that natural processing of pollutants in the soil and through plants. It inhibits the recharge of groundwater. And this one is actually kind of interesting. So if we think about our underground reservoirs of water, the water from rainfall and rain events is not able to get into those. And so it ultimately leads to our streams and waterways having a reduced base flow. And a base flow is the amount of water that's just typically in a stream on a given day. So over time, that leads to lower water levels in some of our streams and waterways. It also provides, so these have, so blacktop and concrete, all of that is a surface that accumulates pollutants. And I'll go to that in the next slide a little bit as well. And it also provides kind of an express route for trash and other pollutants to enter our waterways. So I'm sure all of us have seen something like this during a big rainstorm. You're in a parking lot and you can see the water is pooling, it might be an inch deep or half an inch deep, and it all runs along into a big drain. And we can see here we've got these nice, not even nice, but we've got these silvery trails of motor oil or other issues, other things that were in the parking lot spilled there. Could be fertilizer, herbicide, fluid from cars, like windshield wiper fluid or other brake fluid. All kinds of different things like that are just kind of sitting on the surface of these. So, they're sitting right on the top of the concrete. And so whenever it rains, all that rushes off into our waterways. And we don't really want that. Of course, that's one of the big problems with water quality here in the US. So you have things like nutrients, that would be fertilizer coming from, lawns and turf areas. Pathogens, could be from things like pet waste, not so great, or dead animals, kinds of things. Sediment, so like in areas where they're doing development or building homes or new construction, a lot of times you'll notice there's big piles of dirt or just areas that are exposed. And so a lot of times that can run off into the streams and cloud them up. And really, you don't want that to happen because it can clog things. And all your dirt's washing away too, right? Toxic contaminants, kind of what we mentioned before with things like motor oil or herbicides and pesticides, debris. So any of those litter or other trash that's maybe laying in our parking lots or laying out on the streets, that's all going to get washed in. And then finally, one that's kind of interesting is thermal stress. So as those surfaces heat up from the sun, and I'm sure all of us know if you go to your car in the summer, it's hot, and it's hot walking across the blacktop. So as the water lands on those areas, it becomes warmer, and the warm water rushing into our small streams can really disrupt those biotic processes. So all these are really good reasons to think about ways that we can change how water moves on our property, and how we can kind of try to address some of these problems. So the old school way of doing it is the collect, concentrate, and convey. So here you can see the roof is a roof is a big expansive flat, right? And so that all runs into our gutters and down our storm drains. Here you can see in this house, it's coming down the pipe here, and it's going onto another roof, and then it's draining again. And then it's going down the driveway and then rushing out to we don't know where. So that's kind of the old school way of thinking. It's impervious surface to impervious surface to impervious surface. It never hits something that would absorb that fluid. So that's kind of the older, more traditional way. Conveyance and detention. I'm sure all of us have seen detention ponds, which kind of flood during rain events and hold the water, and they collect it there. And their goal is to minimize flooding. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is a very important goal that we need in our urban areas. But it doesn't always have the desired effect, right? So it does maybe minimize flooding on that local level, but it can cause issues with downstream hydrology. So that means if you're thinking about the areas further away from you in your waterways, those people might be getting an abundance of water coming down into their waterways. So for example, I grew up in Kentucky, and we were close to the Cumberland River. The Cumberland River, we were upstream there. So flooding, whenever we had it, or had issues with high water levels, it all ran down to Nashville. So poor Nashville was always getting hammered with our flooding, and it always, of course, accumulates and snowballs by the time it gets to them. So that's one thing to think about with our, that's big picture stuff, but it's still important to understand the concepts. And in these detention ponds, there's very little water quality control. There's no treatment or anything. And sometimes flooding actually can become worse, especially in these little areas. So here's some things we can do to better site design practices. So on the left here, we have connected, which means that the gutter is going to come out. It's going to hit this blacktop, and then it's going to run probably into the street where it's going to be collected in a culvert. So it never hit any kind of soil or plant material where that water could be absorbed. On the right here, we have disconnected. So the gutter is coming down and the water is shooting out into the yard. And while that may not be the most wonderful design, you might end up with some kind of pooling or erosion right there. You could do some different things to kind of mediate that. It's still better to have that water rushing out into the yard than it is to have it running out into your driveway, then into the culvert and other things. It just allows for a little bit more collection and capture of that water body. Okay, there we go. So here's another good example of connected and disconnected, right? So on the left, we have connected a parking lot. All the water is rushing down into the drain there. And so that's from impervious surface to impervious surface to another impervious surface. And then on the right, it's a little better to have that blacktop with the grass buffer there. So the grass buffer is going to kind of help, as the water hits that sidewalk and it rolls off the sides, it's going to go into an absorptive area. And that can help prevent localized flooding. So green spaces really are important for our water quality. They help promote infiltration of the water. They decrease runoff in urban areas. They can provide a buffer between our natural areas and pollutants in more developed sites. And they can help filter those pollutants that are coming off of our blacktop and off of our sidewalks. So here's a nice picture of a rain garden that's actually located inside of a parking lot. And I've seen a couple of these before, and I think they're a really great idea just because parking lots are a really good water collection area. So as rains happen, there's always, it seems like a lot of water is just sitting there on that surface and it doesn't have a lot of places to go. So this is a great example of how rain gardens can reduce runoff and flooding. And they help maintain the base flow of our waterways. If you remember what I was saying earlier about how groundwater recharges and that helps keep our streams where they need to be. And so they also help clean the water and remove some of those pollutants. And so it's kind of just like a nice, inexpensive water quality control that also can act as a beautification project. So now we've talked about the why and why rain gardens have a purpose and what they do for us, the kind of services that they bring. Now we're going to talk about building your own rain garden, which is all the fun stuff. So a rain garden, just to get our definitions here, is an area in a man-made landscape that's going to capture a very shallow amount of water and hold it for a short time period. The runoff is going to be captured and it's going to infiltrate down into the soil in this indented area. And you have specific plants that are planted there to help facilitate this process. And they can be an attractive addition to your landscape. You want something that's going to maybe add color or interest to an area that previously was just maybe turf grass. So again, they capture that runoff from impervious areas in your yard and on your property. Could be things like patios, the roof of our house, certainly, driveways. And they're going to reduce the amount of water runoff that's leaving our yards. So that's a good thing. Some other things to think about with our rain garden: we do not want them to hold water more than 48 hours after a rain event. So we do not want them to become bogs or places that just hold water indefinitely. That's not the purpose of a rain garden. They should not be wet all the time. We do not want them to be a place for mosquitoes to lay larvae and breed. That's not the purpose of a rain garden and should not happen if it's done properly. A typical depth for a rain garden is going to be anywhere between 4 to 12 inches, with that kind of middle zone of 6 to 8 is the recommended. And if it's done properly and installed properly, it's going to attract those water-loving critters like frogs and toads and maybe some snakes as well. Maybe you don't want snakes in your yard, but it's just a thought. So benefits, again, they're a low maintenance, low water use, and attractive landscape feature. So they can add interest to your yard, if nothing else. They're going to increase the amount of water that can be infiltrated into your in your yard area. So supposedly they can, if done correctly, they can infiltrate as much as 30% more water than just a typical turf grass lawn in the same, area for area. They reduce flooding risks in our home lawns and further away, and also stream bed destruction. So if you're familiar with this, as streams flood, they can sometimes reach high speeds, and that can help, or it can facilitate erosion further downstream. And they can also, of course, provide a different type of habitat within your landscape. So depending on how you create your rain garden and what kind of plants you choose, they could become a habitat for insects or provide a pollinator kind of situation. So they can have a different purpose or a dual purpose. They could just be something that looks nice, or they could create butterfly habitat, as well as doing the purpose of kind of absorbing that water. And I'm going to keep everybody muted here. Yes. Okay, so when we're planning our rain gardens, the big three that we need to think about are the location, the size, and the mixture of plants that we're going to include. And I've also thrown in here just the cost and the labor, because that's always something we want to think about, right? We don't want to just, have this grandiose idea we're going to put 100 by 100 foot rain garden in our yard, and we're like, whoa, that actually costs a lot because we had to rent a bulldozer. That's not, necessarily what I'm advocating for. I just want you to think about the time and energy you might put into installing this, and the cost of the plants that you're going to put in. So this is all the kind of logistical stuff here. So I'm going to go through several slides where I talk about kind of how to figure out where to put the garden, how to calculate the size, thinking about infiltration, and slope of your area that you're going to put it in. So when you're locating your rain garden in the landscape, you want to think about where it's going to do the best good for you. Okay, so we wanted to, first of all, I want to really stress at least 10 feet away from a building foundation, right? We do not want it close to our buildings. We do want it near something like a patio, a driveway, or a road, although it doesn't have to be. It could be somewhere like a kind of a natural ditch line, a slope, just an area where water is naturally moving in your yard to a lower spot. And you want something that's going to fit into the aesthetic of your landscape as well. You don't want something that kind of looks more like a sort, out of place. So some locations to avoid, again, let's stress, don't put it next to your building foundation, because sometimes water can be problematic with a foundation. We don't want that to happen. We also don't want to put it over a septic system, which I think is intuitive, but sometimes we don't know where our septic lines are at. So it's something to think about before installing something like this. We don't want to put it anywhere that water just stands for very long periods already, because that can indicate there's a high water table in that area. We don't want to put it inside the drip line of any trees, just because that's going to compete with the trees. It could damage the roots when we're digging, and it's also going to make digging very difficult in that area. And slopes that are greater than 12%. We don't want any really steep slopes for our rain gardens. It's just going to be too difficult to accomplish the purpose that we're doing, as well as install it. So the big things that are going to affect the size of your rain garden, because we want to create the size to fit your landscape, right? So you want it to address the needs that you have, and you're going to tailor it to that. So we're going to look at how to calculate areas of drainage. We're going to talk about depth of ponding of the rain garden, and then your soil type and the slope of the location as well. All these factors affect how big your rain garden is going to be, how deep it's going to be, and what you should plant there. So when you're sizing your garden, here's a nice schematic, right? So this is, let's pretend this is our house. We've got like a nice ranch style home, kind of with a low roof. And we have 4 areas that we've identified. Okay, so we went outside and we walked around our home. We have 4 different gutters, or downspouts here. And each one of these is coordinated to the area that it goes into. So what you would want to do is divide up your roof and kind of figure out which areas filter into which gutter. And then, so let's say we're going to put the rain garden in the back here of this purple zone of the light, kind of the lavender one. You want to calculate the area. So height times width, of course, and get your square footage. And that's going to help you understand. And we're going to take that number to the next slide here. So you've got your roof plan divided into the different areas, calculated out for to get the total area going into your garden. And so that would also apply if you're doing something like a driveway or a patio. So now you're going to think about the type of soil that you have. So if you have a sandy soil, you can kind of aim for about 5 to 8% of the runoff. Clay soils, you need to be a bit bigger because they're not going to be able to absorb as much as quickly. It's about 10 to 15% of your runoff area. So let's say that, here's a good math example. If we came up with 1,800 square feet for our roof space that was going into that particular downspout, then we would take 0.6 times 1,800 to get about 108 square feet for our garden as kind of like our target size. And a clay soil, if you notice here, once we do the calculation with it, we're going to get about double the size for a clay soil versus a sandy soil. So that's something to think about. Those soils need to be, or rain gardens that are installed in those soils need to be larger in order to adequately absorb the amount of water that we want it to. And so if you do your math and you're like, wow, I'm going to have a rain garden that's like gigantic, it's over 300 square feet. Okay, so we might want to consider making 2 small ones, or you might want to have somebody come in with something like a bobcat or some kind of small thing, because we don't want to be out there digging up 300 square feet with a shovel, because that's just way too much work. So now I'm going to talk about the slope. Okay, so we've talked about the area and the soil type. So slope is actually very important. Okay, so a rain garden on a steep slope can be a little bit smaller and deeper, and one on a flatter slope is going to be larger and flatter. Okay, so think about this. So I've got this example here, and I'm sure you guys have seen things like this before. It's, you have 2 sticks with a big piece of string, and you're going to go out in your yard, and you're going to put 1 stake at the top of the slope where you're more uphill side, and you're going to push the string all the way down to the ground level, and you're going to take it out and stick down your other stake. The most important thing here is that the string going across the 2 of them is tight and that it's level. So if you have a level, or someone in your family has one in their toolbox, it's a good time to get it out. And we're going to calculate the slope. So then we're going to divide our height, which if it's 10 inches, let's say over here, and then we have 100, and then you're going to divide this by this in order to get, and then times it by 100 to get your percent slope. So the steeper it is, the deeper your rain garden should be. So if your slope is really shallow, you can go as low as 4 to 6 inches. A mid-grade slope, you need at least 6 to 7, and anything above 8% is 8 to 12% is going to be about 8 inches deep. And remember, above 12% is maybe too much for your site. You might want to go try to find a better site in your yard, because the 12% is just going to be too much. So now we've got our slope, we have our area, we identified the area coming off of it and how big our rain garden should be. So now we're going to do our permeability testing. Okay, so we're going to dig a hole in our yard that's about 6 inches deep and wide, and then we're going to dump water into it and fill it up. So after 12 hours, we want to make sure that the water has completely been absorbed. If it's holding the water after 12 hours, not suitable location. So if it has gone through within 12 hours, you can repeat the test in that exact same hole. And if it's still standing in the cell hole the second time, then maybe it's still not a good spot. So it needs to be able to drain 2 times. Okay, so do it once and then repeat it again. It doesn't have to be within, so that would be within 24 hours. It's able to go down twice. So if it's still standing, that's just not a good spot for it, or there's possibly a high water table that's preventing that infiltration. So problem soils. So if your soil is high in clay content, or possibly if it's been compacted during development, which is extremely possible. If you think about all the construction equipment that goes over a site when they're building a home, um, all those heavy equipment items will definitely compact the soil in that area. That may create a situation where your yard doesn't have the capacity to infiltrate very well. So you've done all this work, you've identified your site, you've got your slope, you've got everything, and you're like, well, it doesn't drain as good as I was hoping it would. So now one option that you can do is remove all that soil, and you're going to replace it with a better soil that's going to drain better to a depth of 3 to 4 feet below the garden surface. So this is a pretty big operation, right? So if you were going to install a rain garden that's 100 square feet, 10 by 10 kind of area, you're still going to need to dig down to a depth of nearly 3.5 or 4 feet and add in a better draining soil to build back up, and then do all the things you're going to do, right? Create the berm and create a flat bottom, which I'll get to in the next couple slides, and install your plants. So that's something to think about. You can do that if you have an area that doesn't drain very well. It is a lot of work, but it might create a better end product and end result, even though it is a lot of more kind of on the front end. So your ideal rain garden soil mix, if you're digging it all out and you're putting it back in, you might want to have something like 50% sand mixed in with about 20% topsoil, and then 20 to 30% compost. So I want to stress that it should be like real compost, not something that, you're making out of your kitchen scraps, because we want to really monitor the nutrient content of that going in there. And we want to make sure that it's going to break down appropriately. So something that's lower nutrients is desired, and something that's already processed and kind of ready to use in that kind of a situation. I also want to stress you don't want more than 10% to be clay, because clay, it doesn't infiltrate very well. And just again, so 3 to 4 feet below the surface of the rain garden if you're not having the right permeability. And even if you are having pretty good permeability, this is not a bad idea to dig down and kind of excavate out your site before you go back in and recreate it how you want it to be. So now we've done all this work. We got our slope, we got our area picked out, we know our drainage area, we're digging our big hole, and we are going to do a soil test before we do any kind of planting. Okay, so if we're going to go through all this work to get it situated in our landscape, we definitely want a soil test, especially if we're going to put in any kind of shrubs or trees. So what you're going to do is take about 2 cups of your soil and let it dry out. And then you're going to go to one of our offices with your soil sample and drop it off. It costs $12. And then a couple of weeks later, you're going to come get a result, or you're going to get a report that's going to give you the results of your area, what you know about your pH, nutrient levels, and if you need to do anything to amend the soil. So it's going to let you know if you're maybe really acidic, you might need to add some lime, or you may need to add a little bit of fertilizer to that area before you do any planting, okay? And it's definitely important if you're installing trees, because trees are kind of they're a big commitment, right? So once it's in there, tree's in there. You're not going to replant it next year or put new flowers in if they die. So your shape of the garden. So we have all these different factors we're thinking about. And I want to stress that the shape of it should probably be kind of like a jelly bean. That's sort of the best ideal shape. Now there are square rain gardens, there are rectangular rain gardens. I showed you guys some earlier on one of the slides, the one that was in the parking lot between the parking spaces. And that one was just a big long strip. Okay, so they made that one fit the site. So typically they are not square, but it doesn't necessarily matter. I think that like the jelly bean shape is kind of the best for an in-yard installation. You want the long side to go perpendicular to the hillside slope, right? So if you can understand, you look at this picture, you've got your downspout, the water's rushing down this way, and it kind of has a wide net to capture all that water. And then this here is your berm, which you're going to create. And I'll show a good cross section on the next couple of slides. So this kind of is a wall, for better lack of term. And that helps kind of keep the water into this area, helps force it to infiltrate and for the plants to absorb it. So long side perpendicular to the slope and short side parallel to the slope. And also this is just some other thoughts and considerations for you all. Think about where the extra stormwater will go. You cannot send that overflowing into your neighbor's yard, and I do not encourage you to do so. You should think about that. Where is any extra going to go? We don't want to do that. We don't want to have any kind of property dispute. And always remember that your local government has some jurisdiction over those kinds of stormwater things and land disturbing activities. So now we're working on our installations. So here we are, and we've decided this is going to be our spot right here. We've got our uphill stake in the yard still from when we're calculating our slope. And we've got it the right size. Okay, so we're going to dig down into the soil, and this is our desired shape. Okay, so we have this berm that we're creating by packing down soil on the other side. So water is going to rush down this way. It's going to kind of come down into here, into the base now, and it's going to pool. And we're going to have all our plants down in here, and they're going to help absorb it. Okay, and then we have this berm. We want that to be about the same height as this point right here. So we wanted to create kind of a basin. And you can see here's another example on a deeper, or I'm sorry, a stronger slope. So this one you can see here, the bottom, the depth of the garden is deeper, and the berm has to be higher because this point is higher on the other side as well. Okay, so we want those points to be about the same, and depending on the depth that we calculated before as well. So here's some more pointers. We want the bottom of our rain garden to be level. And like I mentioned a minute ago, the top of the berm should be about the same elevation as this point right here. So if your downspouts coming to here, you can have that string going, string going across. Oops. I apologize. So you're gonna have that string going across to that point, and it's gonna be about the same height. So I've also got here on this blue pentagon, I think, it's pointing away, you know, so the water's coming down into here, and it's for the most part going to be absorbed. But as we all know, sometimes we have really high rain events, and those can cause flooding in our yard. So sometimes we might have a rain event that drops 1 or 2 inches. Your rain garden isn't going to be able to handle that. It's going to be able to handle some of it, but you're also going to want to create a small area where the water can then flow out, kind of an overflow. And we can do something like a dry land creek or a dry creek bed, I think they're called. So here's some more pictures. You want this overflow method for any kind of bigger storms. You can do something like pebbles to kind of help direct the water out of there. And typically a good idea that I would suggest is to direct the water where it would have gone before. So if it, before you put this in, it went into your culvert at the bottom of your property, kind of point the water in that direction, so where it would have gone before. So when we're installing our rain garden, we have all these different factors that we've talked about, and you know, we're trying to balance in our head as we're thinking about it. So we're going to lay out the edge of the rain garden with a rope or a garden hose, and we're going to dig into there, and we're going to set aside that top several inches of the topsoil, excavate the hole, and then backfill with that good soil we talked about before, and some of the topsoil that we had from this first initial dig, and make sure the bottom is nice and flat. And we're also going to create the berm on the edge. We're going to pack that soil in really well so that it remains there and helps kind of maintain that shape, that mound shape. So as you know, if you remember, we did our soil test at the beginning of this process, and now we've got, let's say we have our results back. If they say we need to add lime or fertilizer of any kind, this is the time to do so. We want to do this before we have any plants in there and before we even, go any further. And if you're adding any compost at this point, either in nutrients, you want to kind of till it into the whole area. And as you can see in this picture, this is a really great illustration. They're kind of tilling in their compost, but they've also, as you see here, have a nice flat bottom to their rain garden. Okay, so now the fun stuff. There are a lot of different plants that work in a rain garden, okay? So really, depending on your inclinations, what kind of plants you like, what you might have another purpose that you want. You might want it to attract butterflies or pollinators or create wildlife shelter. Any of those can be achieved. Any of those goals can be achieved with the right mixture of plants. So I would encourage you to think about it. You might want to have a mixture of perennials, shrubs, depending on how big your space is. There could be some room for some trees or a tree in your rain garden. The big thing that I really just want to stress is that you need a tough plant, a really tough plant, because it's not going to be watered frequently. And it's going to have to be able to handle these wet, dry cycles. So it's going to have times of its life where it's inundated with water, and then times where it has no water in that environment or it's dried up. So I would encourage you to go with natives in some situations. Some native plants do really good in rain gardens. But just think about what plants you're going to use and if they can handle that. Now, we'll also mention here that annuals do not do well in rain gardens. Absolutely avoid annuals, like flowers, things like that, just are not appropriate for this because they need frequent watering or else they get really pitiful and sad. And that's not what we want. So if you're going to do trees, here's a list of some different ones that do well in a rain garden situation. Now, some of these are dwarf or pretty small and slow growing, and then some of them are quite big. So think about your space before you plant a tree. And if you have the right sunlight conditions for them to grow, some of them will tolerate a little shade, of course. Oh, and this is also a good time to think before we go further into the plants. A rain garden ideally would be in a full sun to a part shade situation. A full shade rain garden might be more difficult because most of these plants like some sun. So I'll go through a couple of the trees here just really quick. And again, like I mentioned in the beginning of the PowerPoint, if you didn't hear me, if you guys want the list of plants, I'm happy to, feel free to send me an email and I'm happy to send this out to you because I'm going to go through this pretty quickly for the shrubs and the perennials as well. So some good trees, we have river birch. It's used ornamentally. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that one. Bald cypress, it creates those knees that come up into kind of the water or they grow around the base. They're very much a swamp living tree, a water lover. Bald cypress is a good choice. Loblolly pine's a good choice. But of course, these are full-size trees. These are not dwarf trees. Red maple and ginkgo are good for color in the fall. Crepe myrtles and sweet bay magnolias are good for some of the flowering. If you want a tree that has some flowers to it. Green ash and tupelo are both attractive native trees that do well in a rain garden situation. They have some fall color. And then finally, willow oak is a good one. That'll be a slow grower, and winter king hawthorn as well. So those are some trees that would do good in a rain garden situation. I also would mention French tree is really nice, kind of a more scrub tree. It's very fragrant in the spring. That's one that was on the list earlier. And then for our shrubs, some native azaleas do really well. Virginia sweetspire, Oak leaf hydrangeas, those would be some of the ones I would recommend. Think about how you want your garden to look year round. So most of these are deciduous. They're going to drop leaves. Some of them may flower at certain times of the year. They may have berries. And I have actually some notes here on these if we can go through them a little bit more slowly. I think we have some extra time. So deciduous shrubs can be good because they provide that seasonal interest. So if you only have 1 or 2 shrubs in your garden, you might consider one of these. They might have fall color, and they're going to have more of a natural growth form as well. So actually, first I'm going to talk about these two because they are not deciduous, they're evergreen. So Yappon Holly is a good one. This one comes in a weeping form. Hollies have those nice red berries. Inkberries, another one that's going to be evergreen that would do well. Inkberry is actually related to holly. They're in the same family, kind of a similar type plant. Arrowwood is good. It has nice fall color. That's one of the big things with arrowwood. It does create flowers in the spring. It can get about 6 to 15 feet tall. So it's, you know, some of these are good sized shrubs and trees. You want to think about that you want to think about the final size of your shrubs and trees when you're putting them in a rain garden, because typically rain gardens are a small installation in your yard. You don't want the tree or shrub to overtake it over time. But still, I'd like to go through the shrubs and just talk about them because I think they can make a really nice addition. Wax myrtle is evergreen. That's another one. Can get up to about 15 feet tall. It has nice glossy leaves. Bottlebrush buckeye creates a nice white plume in July, and these sort of panicles. It can get quite tall as well, up to 12 feet. And then oak leaf hydrangea. This is one that many of us are familiar with. It has a nice fall color, has nice blooms in the spring, and just has a really nice kind of organic, natural shape to it. They're not like a nice ball. My mom has some, and she's always like, how do I prune these things? But they're a nice shrub, I think, that would do really well in a rain garden. And then finally, beautyberry. This is one that creates these sort of really attractive berries in the fall. Let me see what I've got here on my notes on them. They're deciduous. They can get up to about 6 feet tall. And then, yes, they create berries, and those attract birds in the fall. So here's some ground covers, not something that you typically think of for a rain garden, but if depending on your site, they could be a good addition to the different shapes and textures that you're including. So most of these are actually green year round, which I find kind of interesting. Could be fragrant. The ginger does create a bloom. Partridge berry has kind of an ivy growth form, very low growing. Mondo grass, I'm sure many of us are familiar with liriope. It's very similar to that. Ajuga and strawberry begonia, just some other good options for kind of a ground cover and just to add some visual texture. So those are some options for ground covers. Not what I typically would think of with a rain garden, but again, depending on how you want to design that, they could be a good addition. And then finally, I'm at the perennials, which is really my favorite part. And what I really think of with a rain garden, typically the plants that I would envision are these, right? So there's many different perennial flowers that do well in a rain garden. This is not a conclusive or definitive list by any means. And many of these are pollinator plants too, if you guys are familiar with that. Many butterflies like these, many bees as well. So these are going to have a dual purpose in your landscape if you decide to plant any of them. And again, I just want to stress for all these are a little bit different on their conditions, but most of them, with the exception of the ferns, are going to need full sun or part sun, part shade kind of situation. If you have a more shadier situation, I think the ferns might be a good suggestion. They do well in those more shadier sites. So here's some good ones to talk about right up front. Candle lilies, I'm sure most of us are familiar with them. They can get quite tall. They have really nice sort of banana leaf foliage. I always think of them as very tropical. They come in a wide variety of colors, and that's in both the leaves and in the flowers. And they're tall and just kind of add a nice glossy appearance. So I really like canna lilies. Ironweed, that's another one that's, I believe it's native, and don't quote me on that. I'd have to go back and check, but it's definitely something that grows wild. It's naturalized if it's not native, and it is a pollinator plant. It can be up to 9 or 10 feet tall in the right situation. It has these really brilliant purple clusters at the end of the year. It's definitely one that's going to attract pollinators, and it spreads over time as well. St. John's wort, it's one that you might have seen in the herbal areas of a store. It does have some medicinal properties, but it creates yellow clusters, and it can be tall as well, up to about 4 feet. So ferns, one of the ones that we mentioned a minute ago, cinnamon fern, it creates these nice, attractive little brown sticks coming up. So ferns do really good in rain gardens because they like that more moist environment. Royal fern, this one is a native. It's another one that could be good. Swamp milkweed, I'm sure all of you recognize for its pollinator purposes. That's another native that can do well in a rain garden. And then these three as well. So asters are really nice, and they're a very diverse flower group. So you can get them in a wide variety of shapes, heights, growth habits. Most of them do have a purple flower. I haven't seen a lot of them, or white maybe. Most of them are more in that color family, but they come in a lot of different shapes and types. And they can be a really good pollinator plant because they bloom kind of in the late fall when not a lot of other stuff is blooming. So they're good for that kind of late fall color. Black-eyed Susan, that's one of my favorites personally. They have a really sunny sort of look to them. They have abundant flowers and kind of the sun. Let's see what other notes I've got on them. They are native, and they have a summer bloom, and they can get about 3 feet tall. Joe Pyeweed, that's another pollinator plant. It is native and can get up to 7 feet tall. So those are some good kind of dual purpose plants that look really attractive in a rain garden. And things to think about. So these are some plants to avoid. Okay, so do not plant coniferous shrubs in your rain garden. They don't like that. Exotic azaleas do not do good. I just stress that they're exotic. So if you do want to put an azalea in your rain garden, if you have more of a shady site, just do your research and make sure that it's native, because a lot of our native azaleas do okay in a rain garden situation. So just make sure that it's not an exotic azalea. Indian hawthorn, not a good one. Camellias really hate wet feet, so do not put a camellia in your rain garden. It will not be happy. So those are just some suggestions, and anything that isn't native or maybe is exotic and just is susceptible to root rot, it's not going to do good in this situation. And also, again, just to stress, do not put annuals in your rain garden because they cannot handle the wet dry cycle. They're not good for that. And even if you had them on the edge or something, I really just would not put any kind of annual flowers in your rain garden. And then finally, maintenance. Okay, so typically there's not going to be special maintenance. Rain gardens really, in my opinion, should be something, an area of your yard that you want to kind of naturalize. You're going to want these plants to sort of spread and over time and kind of become just a part of your landscape. They may need divided over time as they expand. Weeding, just your typical pruning, kind of general maintenance stuff. It shouldn't be something that is going to be a high maintenance part of your lawn. It's going to be something that kind of takes care of itself and remains naturalized throughout the year. So with that, I'm going to move on to questions. And I actually have, these are the publications that I was talking about for you guys. This one, I'll go ahead and put these in the chat. Let me get back to our chat here. Give me just a moment. Okay, so this one on the bottom is from the EPA website, and it's kind of a, I looked at it yesterday. It has a lot of different resources. Let's see if I can get, okay. It has a lot of different links to other articles, directions, kind of some recommended plants. It has a lot of information on that site. And then this one is one from University of Kentucky. That's where I did my graduate work. So I'm a little partial. And UJ doesn't have a specific rain garden publication that I've been able to find. So this one, I think, does a really good job of explaining the logistics, the slope, and digging it all out, and the planning stuff. So I wanted to make sure that I gave you all an extra kind of document, because there is kind of a lot of different math parts in the design of your rain garden. So if you have something to kind of go back to and reference when you're in that planning stage, I thought this one did a really good job of explaining it. Now, the plants may not be adapted to our area, so make sure that you read that and research any plants that you want to use from that publication. So with that, I will take any questions. I will do my best to answer them. And you guys are welcome to put them in the chat if you want, if you have any questions. And while I'm thinking about it, I will also give you guys a survey that you can fill out about this presentation and upcoming stuff as well. Okay, so Anne asked, can you use this pond side on a low-lying area? So I assume you mean like an area in your yard that possibly holds water already. And I wouldn't necessarily encourage you to put it in an area that holds water. But an area of your yard that water maybe moves through to a lower spot would be a good one. If it's just holding water all the time, that may not be a good situation because it doesn't seem like it drains. So you want something, you know, like maybe a ditch line is a good one. An area where your yard might slope away into a ditch or into like a culvert or something, that would be a good spot as well. And that area may work. I don't know your specific site, so I'd have to see it probably to have an idea. Or oh, it's close to a pond. I don't know that that would really serve the purpose unless your yard is filtering into that pond. And so then, yeah, it might be a good spot if you're if you move it up a little bit further. So if your house is like kind of on top of like a low hill, and then the pond is kind of at the edge of your yard, I'm assuming. So kind of in that middle zone would be a good area for the water that's running down slope. That would be a good spot. So because then it's going to catch the water coming down from your just regular lawn, or maybe your driveway or patio kind of situation. It would catch it there before it goes into the pond. So that would be good. Do you all have any other questions on rain gardens while we're just hanging out? I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording for the evening or for the morning.